Hi, my name is Shelby Redfield Kilgore, and I am the filmmaker of all of these foster care and adoption videos. I just want to say to those of you who are continuing to come to my channel and watch my videos, I just can't thank you enough for supporting my work, for bearing witness to all of these stories, and it means so much to me. And to those of you new to this channel, thank you so much for clicking on this video, and I hope that you will join me on this journey of this new series that I'm creating, Adoption Education, where I'm answering one question at a time. It's been a while since I've added some new videos that are foster care and adoption related, because basically this pandemic has prevented me from filming other people's stories, because usually I travel to different parts of the US, and also because I have been battling breast cancer this past year, and I've been focused on my treatment for that and still working as a freelancer on other TV shows as well. And so I just haven't been able to create new content. But because I am in between freelance jobs now and have a few months before my next major surgery, I have just had this urge to create new content. And so I want to honor that and try and build my YouTube channel and my community in this space about foster care and adoption. And without further ado, I am going to introduce the first episode for Adoption Education, and it's going to be me talking about trauma, answering the question, is adoption trauma real? Specifically for this episode, I'm going to talk about the adoptee and the trauma. Now, I will say adoptees, they do not have a monolithic experience. We all are unique, and we all have different stories. And some adoptees, as adults, they may tell you that they have experienced no trauma from adoption. Some adoptees will say that they have, and it's an ongoing journey for them. For me personally, I believe adoption is a lifelong journey. And I believe that I had trauma from my adoption. And I remember it being as early as 5 years old when I understood what adoption meant. And I was heartbroken to know that I had another mother out there who wasn't able to take care of me because she was too poor. I was told that she loved me so much. She gave me up to give me a better life that she couldn't afford to do. And since then, I had separation anxiety. I felt like there was something missing in my life, and I had a lot of low self-esteem, low self-worth. And to complicate matters, being a transracial adoptee, because I was adopted from Korea. My parents are both white. I had issues with how I looked. I didn't want to be Asian. I remember kids bullying me and calling me flat face and doing the sing-song chant, Chinese, Japanese, look at these, and they would pull their face back to try and make their eyes look like mine, and being called Twinkie, yellow on the outside, white on the inside. And I grew up in an environment where I could share about my adoption experiences and the emotions and feeling conflicted, how sad and heartbroken I was that I didn't know who my biological mother was, and that did she love me? Who did I look like? Anytime I saw an Asian woman or family out in public, because where I grew up in Florida is very predominantly white, I would think, oh, am I related to them somehow? That's, what went through my head. This feeling of not feeling loved enough was very predominant in my life growing up, and it led me to look for love outside of myself. So I would work really hard to try and get praise from my parents and my friends and teachers, and that would fill me up for a time, but it was only temporary, and so I had to keep doing that. And like living in that kind of way where you're constantly trying to get praise from people to fill a hole inside of you is draining and tiring, and it's not a way to live your life. And that was hard for me to try and change direction in as I became a young adult. I remember when I was 5 and I thought if I didn't get straight excellence, somehow I thought that my parents would send me back to Korea. So that was when I was in 5th grade. I'm sorry, not when I was 5. And so these irrational fears of being rejected, of losing loved ones, was deeply, deeply ingrained in like my DNA or something, because it was always a common theme that kept coming up. Even as an adult, I have nightmares that my loved ones will leave me and I wake up crying, or it's pretty terrible. But yeah, so trauma for me and relating it to adoption has been something I've been aware of since I was 5. And that's why I think adoption is a lifelong journey. And for the adoptees that don't have any memories from their adoption trauma, I completely believe them, that they don't have memories of it, because maybe it was prior to 4 or 5. And just because they don't remember doesn't mean it didn't happen. And we've learned from experts that trauma can be delayed, and then it can be manifested in different stages of our lives when it's triggered. And so I have spoken with different adoptees over the years that have said they didn't really look at their adoption and some issues that have come up, like with separation anxiety or in their relationships with people, how that's affected them, until they were much older, in 30s or 40s or 50 years old. And sometimes it's a singular event that that triggers the trauma, like having their own biological kids, and then realizing this is the first time that someone mirrors them, that they have genetic ties to this little human being, and so it triggers something in them. I've heard adoptees that when their child reaches the age that they were adopted, it's very hard for them, because they have these feelings of, how could she give me up? I could never in my mind ever think of doing that to my child. There are times, when the trauma is triggered when they lose an adoptive parent. That loss, that deep, deep loss, triggers the loss that happened when they were a baby. And there's just so many things that happen that can trigger an adoptee in different ways. I've talked to adoptees that have been adopted at birth. I have talked to people that have been adopted as an older child through the foster care system. Adoptees in same-race families or transracial adoptive families. Adoptees that were born in a different country and brought over to the U.S. There's always this common theme that I have encountered, and that is that a lot of them have dealt with feeling like there's something missing in their life, struggling with finding a sense of belonging, struggling with identity, and some feel not loved enough like me, but some do feel like they're loved enough, but there's still something that they can't put their finger on that makes them feel still like they're finding their place in the world and where they fit in. but also most adoptees I've spoken with struggle with separation anxiety or this fear of loss. And that's why I believe that there is adoption in trauma. And now, with my personal experiences and the experiences of other adoptees that I've talked to over the years, and seeing the common themes of what we all struggle with, the science, the neuroscience tells us that there is trauma in adoption for the adoptee. And I'm going to break that down for you, but I will preface that I am not a trauma therapist or an expert on the subject matter. And if you want to listen to someone who is, please check out my Beyond Biological series, episode 2. I have put the link down in the video description, and also a card should pop up as well. But Jules Alvarado is a trauma therapist, well renowned in around the world actually for the work that she does. But basically, in this series, I filmed her giving a talk to a group of people in Appalachia about how trauma impacts the brain. And the big thing that really hit me was that trauma impacts the brain the same for everyone, regardless of what the trauma is. And there is this doctor named Karen Purvis who wrote a book with another person, I believe, called The Connected Child, where she talks about the 6 hard places of trauma. And she lists in utero, at birth, immediately after birth, if there's abuse, neglect in the childhood, those also could be hard places of trauma, as well as a isolated event. And so why there is a trauma in adoption is it can happen in utero. Most mothers that are struggling with whether or not they are able to parent the child, a lot of the times that stress can be very traumatic for them. And at 6 months, the amygdala is functioning for the baby in utero. And so if mom is experiencing trauma, so is baby. The amygdala is the fear response of the brain. And so basically it's what kicks us into fight, flight, or freeze. And how the amygdala takes in information in our brain is through the 5 senses. So what we see, hear, taste, smell, and touch. And basically when you're a baby, and even as an adult, anything novel, like new, can elicit fear. And when that fear is elicited, it can kick your brain into the amygdala into fight, flight, or freeze. And what happens is the amygdala signals to the hippocampus that something is wrong. And the hippocampus starts to kick out this natural hormone, like cortisol, to help bring the brain back to regulation. And that cortisol floods the frontal cortex, like the front part of our brain, which is in charge of executive decisions, emotional decisions, because the amygdala is referred to as also the reptilian brain or the primitive brain. So we haven't gotten to a point where we know how to shut that off, like when it's kicked into the fight, flight, or freeze. As cortisol is being pumped into the front part of the brain, the brain cannot function optimally. And if that is occurring over and over again, if the child or the baby is experiencing trauma over and over again, the brain will not develop properly over time. And this can cause major issues down the road. This is why experts say that even babies separated at birth from their mother and handed over to strangers, their adoptive parents, like at birth, the day that they are born, is traumatic because the baby is used to its mother's smell, its mother's voice, everything about its mother. And then being placed into the arms of someone new, this elicits fear, and therefore their brain is kicked into fight, flight, or freeze, and they're crying or however they're responding for the loss of their mother, what they are familiar with, what they have known up until that point. So that's why there is trauma at birth. And in utero, if the mother is experiencing trauma, so is baby. And immediately after birth is usually the 72-hour window. It's like a critical period to try and minimize the trauma that the baby may be experiencing as much as possible. When you really look at it, by the time a baby, even at birth, goes to its adoptive parents, it's probably experienced 3 traumas in its life at that point. And then babies, even adopted below the age of 2, usually there would be trauma in utero, trauma at birth, immediately after birth, and then they would be placed with a foster care parent. When they're moved from their foster care placement to their permanent placement, their adoptive parents, that's traumatic as well. So usually 4 times for even a child having to go from a foster placement to their adoptive parents. And then there is the possibility of trauma happening later on in life that triggers their adoption trauma. So it's just important to be aware of like the impact of trauma to the brain. And everyone, of course, responds to it differently. It may be triggered, at different times for different people. As like the child grows older. But it's important to be aware of that because what I've learned with some adoptees that grew up in an environment where they didn't feel safe to express their conflicting emotions about adoption, when their voices are, or how they feel is minimized or diminished, or they are told like not to feel that way, when that's not validated, then a lot of times children try and push that down, suppress those emotions. And then what happens is they're delaying a process of healing, a process of grieving, a process of allowing the trauma to unfold in a healthier way rather than to be triggered down the road unexpectedly. Basically, me sharing with you about the trauma in adoption for the adoptee, it is to educate hopeful adoptive parents, people looking to foster even, people looking to go into social work or into therapy, counseling. It's important to know about the trauma in adoption to better understand your child and to better understand how you can help your child walk through this trauma. Because if it's not recognized when the child starts bringing it up in whatever way, verbally or through actions, like it's important for parents to be ready to support their child in the way that they need to be supported and to help them walk them through that trauma. And so to go into an adoption, especially parents that adopt children at birth thinking that their child has had no trauma and that it should be much easier to raise them, that's not the case. And it's just important for adoptive parents, for you guys to know, and for foster care parents as well, that this trauma is real and not to ignore it, or not to think that it's not a part of this story. And maybe your child will not express, or really, maybe that trauma won't be triggered until they're adults. But also be ready to help them as an adult too, because adoption is a lifelong journey. And I think the minute that you come to accept that, the better you will be as a parent. And I just want to say thank you so much for joining me on this journey as I start this new series about adoption education. And the best way to support my work so I can continue to make these films is to make sure to subscribe, like, comment, and ring that notifications bell, as well as share this with your friends, family, and community. You never know who this might help. I also helped co-author a book with another adoptee named Veronica. It's a book called Rooted in Adoption, a collection of adoptee reflections, and that was published back in 2020. And I will put down a link below in the video descriptions. Also, I will put down a link for Etsy and Redbubble with some merchandise that will also help Veronica and I in our endeavors to help foster and promote awareness about foster care and adoption. So thank you so much for watching. And next week I will be answering the question, should adoptive families celebrate Gotcha Day or Adoption Day?